It is time for the final panel. Yes. Yeah. Keep that energy up. We really have today been blessed by just so many amazing speakers and thinkers, and this panel is no exception. The goal of this panel was to help us walk out of this building thinking about Malcolm's legacy of radical politics, and to really think about even what this idea of radicalism is in the context of Malcolm. And also to think about what a radical politics can and should look like in 2019 if we are to really operate in the tradition of Malcolm and Malcolm's interlocutors and Malcolm's teachers and Malcolm's students. What does that mean? So I brought together some folk who think about these issues very deeply, folk who do this work on the ground in a variety of contexts. And I reached out and they all say yes. So I'm super grateful. I'm going to start on my far left with the introduction. This sister is just a wonderful human being, a committed activist, part of the first family of Brooklyn, and one of my really most treasured friends. She always shows up, she always does the work, and she does it across a variety of contexts. Many of you know her from the Movement for Black Lives, Malcolm X grassroots movement, and many other short-term and long-term projects. We first started working together on doing work on political prisoners that she pulled me into, and I was very grateful for that. And I've watched her just be consistent, whether it's behind the scenes, whether it's in the front, it doesn't matter. Monifa Bandele is always there, she's always doing the work, and I'm so happy that she came from the People's Republic of Brooklyn all the way down here to be here with us. So please give her a round of applause. This brother, to her right, is one of the most brilliant scholars I know. And again, another beautiful human being. We don't get to talk as much as I'd like, because we're both so busy, but I enjoy how his mind works. I enjoy the way he thinks about issues. I love his scholarship from Exodus forward. That's the name of the book, being biblical. From Exodus forward, you know, the depth of his scholarship, his reach. We were having a little session about you the other day. We talked about footnotes. Me and Jonathan Walton were talking about footnotes. And we said, you know, some scholars are footnote scholars. They read the footnotes, they engage the footnotes, they in conversation with the footnotes, and they take the tradition seriously. The way Greg Carr does, the way, you know, I mean, everybody up here does. It's extraordinary to see. And I'm also heartened to watch the world now begin to see Eddie Glaude's genius on a wider platform, because now he's not only at Princeton University as the chair of African American Studies, he's not just somebody who came out of a Philly tradition, African American Studies master's degree at Temple University. He's not just somebody who went to Morehouse College and was trained in a particular tradition. He's not just somebody who has a deep and wide body of work. He's also somebody who now talks in the public sphere in ways that we need in troubling times. You can catch him on Morning Joe every day, and if you can get up, if not DVR, it's worth it. Because it's very rare on television that you have an opportunity to talk with complexity about an issue. Everything's a soundbite, everything's a blip, and if you start to talk with complexity, you get dangerous. And he's mastered. I've watched him grow into a level of mastery of this genre, so that he can take complex ideas and make them consumable to a general public. And it's important that he brings that radical tradition to the television screen. He does it every day in every aspect of his work. Please give some love to Dr. Eddie Glaude. I met Thenjiwe McHarris at, we met in Palestine. Did we meet in Palestine? That's when we first got the bill. So she has a twin sister, so that's why it's hard for me to remember which one I met first. But I met both of them. One I met at the Drug Policy Reform Conference, another I met at another radical organizing conference.
That's actually a very good story. Because you met my, oh sorry. I I'm sorry, y'all. I'm like this. Forgive me. The story's interesting because you were supposed to meet me, but I couldn't be there, so my sister took my place on the panel.
And they're identical twins, man. But again, you know, we're all so busy, we don't have time to talk and engage one another with any level of depth sometimes because we all moving. But we were in Palestine together for 10, 12 days, a year ago, 2 years ago, child moving. And over that time, I got to see the depth of your analysis. I got to see the way you inject compassion and care into your understanding, to your rigorous political analysis. She's someone who reads widely and deeply. Thenjiwe is also a reminder that you don't have to be in the academy, you don't have to be doing work in the university to be a serious thinker, and more importantly, to be a serious doer. The work she does with the Movement for Black Lives, with Blackbird, with all these organizations and movements is so significant. And I won't say in a moment, due to a tradition of erasing the labor of black women and the intellectual work of black women in our struggle and in our resistance movements, it's so significant to see you here, to have you here, and to watch you labor every day in the service of justice and for the service of our people. Thank you for coming. Please give her just a warm applause. You can't, no, he said keep it short. This is the humility of Tony Monteiro right here. He said keep it short. So I'm just 4 pages. You can't, first of all, you can't have no event in Uncle Bobbie's without having some North Philadelphia representation. This is what we talking about right now, that Tenderloin. I love Tony Monteiro, and again, someone who is a long distance runner in our struggle. He looks 30, but he has been a long distance runner in our struggle. He is a committed scholar, a brilliant scholar. There is no one who has studied Du Bois with greater clarity and care and nuance and attention than Dr. Tony Monteiro. But he's not just a Du Bois scholar. When you look at what happens with Saturday school, we've been talking a lot about building institutions, or we should be talking a lot about building institutions. They can take everything from you at any moment if it ain't yours. And part of what Tony Monteiro has done in this phase, and in earlier phases I'm sure, but in this phase of his tremendous career, is to help build institutions, to create space for critical dialogue and for community education. He ain't doing it for attention, ain't no cameras there, he ain't doing it for the money. He took an oath of poverty like most of us radicals did a long time ago, but he's committed to the work, and you can find him out there on Thanksgiving with our dear sisters. Oh my God. Sakari Rose, I was thinking about her the other day. We need to talk about her at some point. He operates a tradition enough to honor sisters like Pam Africa. By the way, we got Pam Africa in the building. And now a Philadelphia legend, a freedom fighter, a hero, the minister of confrontation. And Tony's like the axis of all of those things. He connects all those people, all those traditions, all those movements. When the nation's there, he's there. When the Ram is there, he's there. When Uncle Bobbie's opens, he's there. Saturday school, he's there. I don't mean to, I want to say this while you're here, man.
That's right.
I'm going to tell you now, man. We love you. We love you and we appreciate you. And you came to Uncle Bobbie's in the People's Sanctuary today for this purpose. So I want to thank you for being here, and I want to thank all 4 of you all for being here. Let's get this thing going. Let's talk about Malcolm X. Throughout the day, one of the recurrent threads has been that Malcolm X, the radical dimension of Malcolm X is either missing, it's erased, or it's mischaracterized. What should we know about Malcolm and the radical tradition that we do not? Help us think about this. We can start with anybody. Tony Monteiro.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for having me here. When we think about Malcolm X's contribution to radical politics into the 21st century, I think it's important, first of all, to talk about him not so much as a radical in the ways that we talk about that today, but as a revolutionary. And I think it is not just a subjective definition, in other words, him defining himself as a revolutionary, but it is really his political and ideological relationship to the major forces of the epoch in which he lived. And I would like to just say quickly, what is that epoch? Because the epoch in which he lived is the epoch in which we live. It is the epoch of the profound crisis of the world system of imperialism, of economic depression, of the struggle for national liberation and for revolution. Malcolm is born, he goes to jail a year before India kicks the British out, which was a monumental achievement, contrary to what a lot of revisionist scholars are saying at this time. He goes to jail 3 years before the Chinese Revolution. He comes out as the Korean War is ending. If we listen to Malcolm X beyond the ballot or the bullet, what we see is a man committed to the revolutionary transformation of the world into which he was born. I'll just end on this. His commitment to the ideas of Bandung, the Bandung Conference of 1955, Afro-Asiatic solidarity in the fight against colonialism. And, just one thing I would add to what the panel before us said, is that one of the identities that members of the Nation of Islam had in those days is that they were Asiatic black men. That the African American people, as such, Du Bois in Black Reconstruction said that the black worker was everything African. To it, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad said that we were connected to Africa and Asia, and that the liberation of black people would be a part of the great anti-colonial struggle, which ultimately, as Malcolm realized, and that was his connection to the Chinese Revolution and to the Cuban Revolution, would involve the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism and the achievement of a system of human values and the organization of society and economy in a moral way, the redistribution of wealth and income to serve the needs of the poor. So I would say Malcolm's radicalism is finally revolutionary struggle, and that is, I think, his final legacy to the 21st century.
Yes. It's hard going into that. How you doing? Good evening. I'm a call and response sister, so good evening. Good evening. Thank you. First, I just want to say I'm very humbled, very honored to be here, so thank you for inviting me. Also very humbled to be here with such beautiful black minds. I love black people, and with such beautiful black minds who are asking fundamental questions about blackness, about black liberation. And I'm also humbled because of the diversity of thought. There are things that have been said that I don't agree with. Things that have been said that I do agree with. But one thing that I was sitting here and speaking with others on this stage, what I recognized is, this is the work. Like, freedom ain't easy. If you stay in a corner and you talk to people that only believe what you believe, black people will never be free. And so I am privileged and honored that I get to be here and say, thank you for everything that you said. It stimulated me, it awakened me, and now I want to get into a debate with you. Like, freedom ain't free and it ain't easy. And we're going to have to debate some of this stuff. So I just want to say thank you for that. Ooh, I had a whole bunch of notes, but then I just came up here. What I will say when I think about Malcolm X, and again, I'm also honored because I'm not an academic. I haven't studied to the extent and the depth that so many people up here have. But when I think about people who have inspired me to be the organizer I am, Malcolm X is one of them. And so I'm honored to be here and just think and remember and listen and be anchored in that. So a few things just around sort of like Malcolm X and radical politics. Malcolm, at a particular time, talked about root causes. And when I think about, he's a radical theoretician, but when I think about what does it mean to be militant, it's the courage to name your enemy. And to not be distracted, to not be subtle, but to name a thing, and point at your enemy. And I think that is the reason, that's one of the reasons why Malcolm X was such a radical politician. One, Malcolm X was a leader, he was an orator, but he was also an organizer. He believed in organizing the black working class, much of which the left has always seen as the unorganizable. And Malcolm X centered the black working claess. He centered it in a way in which he threw out this respectability. Malcolm X was talking about respectability politics before we thought, woke culture started talking about respectability politics. He organized the black working class in a way in which that truly spoke to him. And then just two other pieces I want to name is, obviously, his internationalism is so fundamental, and so much of our work as black organizers of black radicals in this time builds on the legacy of that kind of black internationalism, that tenets of Pan-Africanism. And to know that our struggles are deeply linked up with each other, black liberation struggles around the world, and then also all oppressed people around the world, is why he's such an important theoretician and black radical. The other piece I just want to name is also whether we agree around his evolution of thought or not, but the ways in which Malcolm X evolved over time, and also it exposed it to us. Like, we saw it. Teaches us so much about what does it mean to go through one's political journey. What does it mean to evolve in one's political journey and political thought is so important when understanding the kind of black radicals that we want to be in this moment.
Thank you so much for Mark for organizing this. This has been enriching so many different levels. It's been enriching on so many different levels. Let me just say these three things really quickly because I'm interested in the dialogue. One, I think there are three features of Malcolm's radical politics that we need to kind of unpack. One is his radical imagination, two is his radical historicism, and three is his radical critique of racial capitalism. So, radical imagination. I think his notion, I want to say radical imagination because he has an expansive understanding of himself, rooted in his formation in the nation. And I want to say this in this way, that the Nation of Islam is part of a broader current during the beginning of the 20th century, in which black people are thinking about themselves in international terms. So even the way in which Noble Drew Ali is imagining black people, the way in which the Nation of Islam is imagining. So there is a kind of lithic imagination that isn't limited to the US nation state. A religious imagining that is thinking about black people globally, that's connected to a politics that hasn't been domesticated just yet. Right? The kind of compromise that black political elites make with the US nation state to render its political critique as only a domestic critique hasn't happened yet. So this is the context that produced the Council on African Affairs. This is the context in which black folk are imagining their politics in a global setting as the darker peoples of the world are resisting, right, Western imperialism. So this radical imagination is important. It has its beginning there, but we don't want to make the genetic fallacy, right? It doesn't stop there, right? So there's a part of what we see when we read Malcolm closely, that there is not only a theological debate going on within his time in the nation, there's a political debate. Are we going to hit the spiritual side, or are we going to hit the political side? That's all we got to do is read the introduction to the 1963 speech in Detroit, Message to the Grassroots. Malcolm says explicitly, if we come in here talking about you're Baptist, you're Methodist, I'm Muslim, then we'll never get anywhere. So let's just leave that at the door. So he makes this critique, he makes this distinction in 63, that we in effect keep our religious commitments, our sectarian commitments in the private sphere. And in the public domain, we all catch hell because we're black. And then when he breaks, however we account for the breakdown, he makes a distinction. Those of you who are interested in the spiritual component, go to the Muslim Mosque Incorporated. Those of you who are interested in the political component, let's talk about the Organization of African American Union, right? And so he makes this distinction, which has something to do with how we might lead, here I'm going to sound like a nerd, how we might read the autobiography. We can read the autobiography as an example of a spiritual exemplar, or we can read it as an example of a secular exemplar. In other words, you can read it like Augustine's Confessions, or you can read it like Rousseau's Confessions. You're going to get something different out of it. Radical imagination. He imagines himself in expansive terms. Second issue, radical historicism. What we see in the 350 days, and even what we see before the 350 days, is Malcolm is engaged in a deep sea dive in contextualizing black struggle, trying to keep us, as Tony said, from limiting how we understand black folk and the hell we're catching by the history of the United States. Right? He's engaged in accounting for the decolonization of the quote-unquote third world. Right? He's involved in connecting our movements to those movements so that we can see ourselves in more expansive terms, connected to the radical imagination. And involved, and part of that takes us to the third point, which we can talk about really quickly, right, is he understands the crisis of late capitalism. He dies because he murdered 65, 350 days. Right? But in that period, right, he sees, right, the contradictions of capital that are going to make themselves known by 68 in France. If you look at the last speech, it's not just an American, not the last speech, it's February 16, 1964 in Rochester. It's a speech entitled, it's not just an American problem, it's a world problem. And he says he had been denied access to Paris. He says, why would Paris not let a Negro like me come in? And then he links what's happening to Paris to what's happening in Britain to what's happening in the United States. And what he's saying is that there's a crisis, right, at the level of capital that they're experiencing. And it is deeply racialized in interesting sorts of ways. So when we read that speech, he's trying to give us an account, right? So Malcolm is tracking a contradiction that will make itself known by 68, but he doesn't live long enough to see how it reorganizes itself post-68. Right? And so I think if we take a lesson from him, understand the importance of a radical imagination, understand ourselves in the most expansive terms. Right? One of the things I've loved reading this passage by Ralph Waldo Emerson, he said, God speaks to us through our imaginations. And I always tell my students, if that's true, then what is the devil doing? Right? So to keep you small. So radical imagination, imagine yourself in the most expansive terms. A deep historicism, understand that genealogy, understand that long continuum of black struggle. Right? And then understand the relationship between our critique of race and our critique of capital.
Yes. All of that, everything, the radical imagination. One of the reasons why we will constantly be in debate about what Malcolm would have done today, what his politics would be today, is because the only thing that was consistent was his evolution. And his radical imagination, for the most part, is unmatched. And many of us, there's no way we could mirror or project what his imagination would have brought him to today. We think we would know, but we couldn't know. So when we talk about the question about Malcolm X's radical politics, I always like to say that Malcolm X was a constellation. He had light on many different movements. There's no single story that you can tell that would explicitly say, this is Malcolm X's politics, right? Because it was always evolving, right? Someone talked about what God was earlier, change is God. And I think Malcolm was in that tradition of evolution, and that being the process of getting closest to righteousness. And so for me, I answer that question through my lens. So what has Malcolm X's politics meant to me? Well, as a womanist and as a radical black feminist, Malcolm X's politics speaks to me in a very specific way, which is to always be challenging and pushing the most radical questions within my movement while challenging without. Making sure that I love and protect my politics so much that I'm constantly challenging it, my mentors, my peers, so that we can be our best selves. That's what I took from the autobiography of Malcolm X. Whatever space I'm in, whatever tradition I'm in, I cannot sit and be complacent. If we grow the biggest, the baddest, the most visible, the most powerful movement in our country of black people, what else inside of it needs to be fixed What needs to be called out? What needs to have the shade pulled off of it? Because we love us so much. Not out of vanity, but out of evolution. So sometimes when I talk about feminism, people want to tell me that Malcolm X would not have been down with feminism. And my response is like, you don't know what Malcolm X would have been down with, because you don't have his imagination.
I want to drill down on a couple of the points that you all raised. One is Malcolm as critic or someone engaged in a deep critique of racial capitalism. We've been coming back and forth to Manning Marable's book all day too, and there's a way that you can read the end of Manning's book and have a very different closing narrative of Malcolm's life. Manning will almost have you believe that Malcolm was curving back to become a mainstream civil rights leader, almost a normal. And the Obama piece, right? That's beyond mainstream. So, and I feel like a lot of the narrative work on Malcolm's legacy is done to corroborate that narrative. How we understand Malcolm is becoming more mainstream, accepting quote unquote true Islam, becoming friends with the mainstream political class, etc., etc. And I think that's a very particular problematic reading. But if you all could talk a little bit about the way in which Malcolm was operated outside of that tradition, in terms of his critique of racial capitalism, in terms of his critique of the possibilities of America. Where was he?
His critique of colonialism and imperialism. There's certain words that we don't use anymore. The anti-imperialist struggle, the anti-colonial struggle. If by racial capitalism we mean world imperialism, then we have something we can talk about. Because I think however Malcolm would have fallen on certain issues of contemporary life, let us be clear on where he stood in relationship to the struggle against his own government. I find it particularly difficult, especially among academics, to listen to all of these reconfigurations of Malcolm and what Malcolm meant to me personally, without a recognition, probably it's done to keep a job, that Malcolm attacked the United States government. He attacked the United States government over the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. He attacked the United States government over the war in Vietnam. He attacked the United States government over its blockade of Cuba and embraced Fidel Castro. I mean, we could go on. China. Malcolm was completely identified, and this is his courage, not just with an analysis, but with a practice, answering, I think, the question that confronts us today. What is to be done besides talk? Are we, or do we have, well, I guess, the first question is, do we have the courage of Malcolm? Let me say one other thing. When Malcolm was in prison, two of his heroes were Paul Robeson and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. These figures were not at opposite ends of the continuum of black ideas, by the way. But when he comes out, he's aware of Robeson and William L. Patterson's petition to the United Nations charging the U.S. government, not France or England, but this government, the government that governs us, of the high crime of genocide against African American people. Malcolm would talk about that continually in the face of a regime that had committed itself to the political decimation of all, as we say today, radical, I prefer the word revolutionary, currents in the society, but in particular those that are anchored in the long history of black resistance. So that's where I would try to answer that question.
I wanted to. And Thenjiwe when I talked about this, Malcolm was most committed to building base and organizing the most marginalized, right? We were just talking about how he had been incarcerated, and when we look at how he built his base, who he went to, how he organized, where he knew that to politicize people, he always embraced the most marginalized within our community. And I don't think it's much of a leap to say that that's who he would be today. Those who are most marginalized by those even within our community in power are people that Malcolm would center and embrace. His human rights framework and the conversations that we're having now around the carceral state and ending mass incarceration, in many ways the work that he was doing was attacking the carceral state by mobilizing the very people that were contained in the cages of it. You know, and that's a base power, a powerful base that understands the carceral state intimately that many don't. And so that, one of the reasons why in the Malcolm X grassroots movement, we focus on freeing political prisoners, right? Shouted out Pam Africa, Mumia Abu-Jamal, is because there's an understanding that there's a tradition in the United States that political repression, the tip of political repression is incarceration, that it's a tool of political repression, that it's not about safe communities, it's not about people being criminal, but it's about community containment and political repression. And so within that tradition, that's why we see so much, even today, when we go and we visit prisoners and we talk to people that are incarcerated, Malcolm X and his teachings is such a presence. People are grabbing on to whatever organization they think identifies most with Malcolm, but what they're really drawn to is Malcolm, is that teaching, and in many ways his old school, that's now modern discussion of deconstructing mass incarceration.
Eddie, I see, I've been watching your wheels turn.
Yeah, I was just trying to think about the way in which the autobiography and Manning's biography works. So the narrative arc of the autobiography is to have Malcolm end up as a kind of example of Western liberalism. He becomes, right, the road to Damascus event is that now he's able to be absorbed into a liberal narrative. And what's interesting about Manning's biography, and it's interesting because of Manning's biography, who Manning Marable is, that Malcolm would end up almost doing some in a similar place as Manning, right? It just makes no sense when you think of who Manning Marable is, right?
Yeah, you're right. You know, Mark,
if you read all of his
this is the crazy thing that happens in that book. That Manning is a social democrat, right. Sometimes called progressive,
has a body of work to show.
Actually liberal.
Right.
You understand what I'm saying? I mean, there is no evidence that Malcolm was any of those. That's what Manning was. And you talk about Malcolm's imagination. That is Manning's radical imagination.
Yeah, and it might very well be Manning's imagination and his editors.
I love Manning. I love him to death.
So we have to ask the question about the production of the book, how Manning was ill and who finished it. So, we can talk about that story offline. But I'm just interested in the way in which both books work as part of an effort or an ongoing process to limit the range of what is politically feasible for black people in the country. Let me say what is politically feasible, not from our vantage point, but from the mainstream's vantage point. There's a way in which you can imagine the political domain of black folk in the context of the 60s, in the context of the 30s and 40s. You have people who are black nationalists, you have people who are communists, you have people who are liberals, you have folk who are anarchists, you have folk who are Garveyites, you got folk who, I mean, the range of black political expression is rich. So the debate is complex in very interesting sorts of ways. And what we have now is just a debate among black liberals. It becomes very difficult to find that radical tradition being in the public domain.
They don't let you on television.
Might be true.
Well,
One person's on television.
that's the neoliberal playbook. The neoliberal playbook is to co-opt the terms, the culture of it, the energy of it, and to limit it just beyond aspirations of freedom, just beyond real revolution, just beyond real liberation. And so that those neoliberal tools, you know, whether it's the books or the storytelling or how the news and the media craft Malcolm, it is to do just that. It's not only just to contain him in our imagination, but it's also to contain what we believe is possible in his tradition and in his legacy.
Let me ask y'all a question, and Thenjiwe, we can start with this. We ain't talked about it all day. This seems like the right place to talk about it. I've been on these internets, and every once in a while, I be Googling stuff and tweeting it. I've been coming up with this hashtag ADOS, and I got to. Where else we gonna do it? So the ADOS movement, right? It stands for American Descendants of Slavery, and it's a very particular movement that has emerged, I would say in the last year or two, ostensibly for reparations. But there's a lot of other stuff attached to it. How can we make sense of a movement that their primary claim is that we are concerned with the conditions of African descendants of slavery, and as we enter the presidential election cycle, we want to be thinking about what these politicians are going to do for people who came specifically out of slavery. We ain't worried about people who was in Haiti. We ain't worried about folk in Jamaica. We ain't worried about nobody in Uganda. We ain't worried about nobody in Syria or Palestine. We worried about right here in the United States. And there's a way that conversation is played out that some read as xenophobic, that some read as too parochial and narrow-minded, and that other folk, maybe even in this room, would say is important because we keep caring about everybody else but the folk who are catching hell because of the legacy of slavery in America. So I'm giving a very generous description of ADOS for the purpose, I'm throwing it out for y'all, but with the legacy of Malcolm in our mind, how can we think, and y'all raised the question of Malcolm's internationalism especially, but Malcolm also was very clear about the effects of the American empire on slavery. How do we make sense of ADOS and those kinds of questions in the legacy of Malcolm?
You gonna kick the ADOS? No, I'm gonna get 100 retweets. So I've said this a few times before, and this doesn't apply to everybody. But I do think we're in a moment where some folks have confused popularity for power, and because of that, our cultural gains are outpacing our political gains. What that means is it leaves us wide open to be co-opted. Anything we popularize without sufficient power will be co-opted by the state. It will be perverted by the state. It will be offered to us on a plate, and then if we have not organized our people will accept it and eat it. And so it is our job to not move towards popularization as a goal, because that's what happened with ADOS and reparations. Now, ADOS is anti-immigrant, it's xenophobic, and if you follow the money of ADOS, where's the money coming from? People that have anti-immigrant agenda. The same people that don't want black people to be liberated, the same people that wants to build a wall, is helping funnel money so that black people can begin to form wedges amongst other black people in the U.S. This doesn't mean that we don't have to discuss and debate and talk. We actually don't talk enough as black people. We need to talk. Exactly. It's just real. But it doesn't mean that we let other people fund sectors of our community to form public wedges and then co-opt the entire important political moment on reparations.
And it's just ahistoric, right? You can't talk about the impact that U.S. slavery has had on us and not talk about the impact that the Haitian Revolution has had on us. You know, these things are intersectional, and they are, our movements are tied, our futures are tied. And so these wedges are also about isolating us. And Malcolm was about the opposite of that. Right? He was about expanding us, expanding our definitions of who we are, what our networks are, and that's why he had extensive travel. That's why he built those relationships, because we can't win like that. number one, okay? And number two, that's really not all of what we are. And especially today, I mean, you know, our families, you know, some of them from the South, some of them from Jamaica, some of them is from Haiti, you know, some came and they, you know, was born in Canada, wherever, you know, we are diasporic. But it is our role as quote unquote African Americans, new Africans, however we want to term ourselves, to understand white supremacy in a way that many in other parts of the globe don't, to not fall prey, to not be tricked by some type of method to divide us from our brothers and sisters. That's our responsibility, because we know what beats the best.
Real quick, let me pause you real quick, because it's 8:12 in the sunset. So anybody who's been fasting today, please know that as of right now, it is, you can break fast, so feel free. If you we ain't got no water, I was gonna give y'all some water, but we got someone back there and everything's up. But yes, just so you know, please continue.
No, I was just going to say really quickly, the best of the Black freedom tradition is about justice. When we're at our best, we're talking about justice. That's not just limited to Black folk. Right? And so if you talk about ADOS in a particular sort of way, the way in which they're running the argument, then it seems to me that you're turning your back on the best of who we are. That's right. Our tradition isn't limited in that way. Come on. It's a betrayal. They haven't read it. If that's the way that they're going to present the argument. That's my opinion.
Yeah, but I don't know that much about ADOS, but I do know that we can't be free without ideological clarity. And that's all sides. Because, what does that mean? Well, that means that we're not the only ones that can be a wedge. You understand what I'm saying? And you talk about global capitalism, they can play all sides of this. And so the fight for ideological clarity, I think that solidarity is indispensable to the liberation of Black people. But solidarity, I've often felt, was mutual aid between forces fighting for common objectives. And I am aware that there is such a thing as neo-colonialism, and that, you know, just like in previous periods of colonialism, neo-colonialism, and especially U.S. neo-colonialism, and especially in the most prestigious universities and some of the not so prestigious universities, produce ideologues and intellectuals of all races. And the target, in a permanent sense, in this country is the Black worker, the Black proletariat, who are being forced into more and more poverty. It is not an abstract question for a lot of people. And it's one thing to say, well, this is this and this is the other, but what is your answer to the crisis for the Black poor produced by immigration in a place like Philadelphia? I mean, we cannot just answer that question with high-sounding phrases. Let me just say one last thing.
Hold on. What do you mean, Black poverty produced by immigration? You're making a
I'm sorry, I didn't mean produced, but the poverty added on to what is already produced by the system, by immigrant labor. That is why some of the most reactionary forces in this country want open borders, going back to Ronald Reagan, because it does lower the price of labor, and it has been used as a wedge against the organization of labor. So I think we cannot answer any of these questions. Black people are not without class divisions among ourselves. And one of the things that has occurred in the post-civil rights moment is that we have, I don't know whether you want to call it a Black bourgeoisie, but we do have a Black elite who are privileged in relationship to the Black proletariat. And we are not all on the same page. And I think if we are talking about Malcolm X, we are really talking about a person who was a partisan of what Du Bois called the Black proletariat.
Organizing work. We can stay
the class division and the country of origin division, I don't want to conflate the two. Right? So we understand, one, that even Malcolm X's mother was a black immigrant. Right? And I think that, I'm not an economist, but I'm really close friends with some. And I think that migrant workers are here for a reason. It's true. There are things that not only opening up the borders, but things happening in other nations specifically to drive people out of those nations, both to take advantage of the labor force there and to bring in cheap laborers here. And that's all part of one larger design, though. And the wages that we're making here that are already low, I feel, are less impacted by additional low-wage workers coming in and more impacted by this hyper-capitalism that is able to pay people the lowest that they possibly can. That there's sub-minimum wages that are in place. You can bring in, when you look at some of the profits that are coming out of these corporations, fair wages could be paid to people born here and people not born here, when you really look at the numbers. So that's a debate, and I think that this is healthy and this is important to have, but I definitely don't want us thinking that additional poor people, poor black people, from the diaspora are in some ways contributing to our poverty. We have to be laser focused that the culprit in our poverty is white supremacy and white capitalism. So I just wanted to say that. So with organizing, I'm glad you asked that, because this week, right now, there is a trial in place around the killing of Eric Garner in New York City. I think some of y'all know that it's been 5 years and not a single nary person who you've seen in that video when Eric Garner was killed has been held accountable in any way, shape, or form. In fact, they've gotten raises and bonuses and vacations and all of that, right? And so when we talk about organizing and we talk about Malcolm X, going to the court this past week where the CCRB, which is our Civilian Complaint Review Board, is bringing up one of the police officers on disciplinary charges. So this isn't even criminal charges. This is to say that you didn't do your job right and maybe you should get fired. It's 5 years later. So this is a whole lot of BS. Is that organizing and base building and building that power in our communities is woefully missing. Malcolm X understood that we had to have a power base, that our people had to be organized in a way that we could force not only the hand of the mayors and the local politicians, but that we could also be the will behind the politicians that are claiming to be on our side. Right? There's not enough of an organized effort to make them do it. And back to what we were talking about with this what I call it the neoliberal playbook, is definitely going down in New York, right? Because you have politicians that can get up there and say everything that we just said. Win the election and fall right in line with the status quo. Because like you said, it's books, it's words, and so we almost have to step away from the terminology and understand that what is at the essence of Malcolm's ideology, which was building black power, right? Building black power in a way that deconstructed white supremacy and capitalism, right? Not reinforced and not created a multicultural capitalism, right? So, organizing has been really tough. It's been hard. Thenjiwe can tell us about, the stuff that's going on, whether it's movement for Black Lives, Malcolm X grassroots movement, Black Lives Matter. We're under attack in ways that we probably won't understand until decades from now. When I talk to my father, who's a member of the Black Panther Party, he always says, we didn't understand all the many ways that our organizing was being undermined at every turn. When they go back to the papers, now they're like, they're messing up that was just, that was a social event. We're going to mess that up. But at every turn, the value's going down. Our organizing is being undermined because our organizing is our power. Yeah. And we step away from it too long, and we have to get back to it. Yeah. And I don't know if Thenjiwe.
Monifa's my leader, so I ain't usually have nothing to say after what you have to say. I mean, so many things are coming to mind. We're always being undermined. We're undermined when we focus on building power, when we focus on organizing. We're also deeply undermined when we choose to have a sort of unapologetic solidarity with other liberation struggles around the world, particularly when it comes to Black liberation struggles in the continent and also the Palestinian people. And so we're always being undermined. But in terms of this piece around what is organizing in this moment, like what's required of us, I keep going back to this piece around like what is Malcolm asking of us and what are we not listening to? In this moment, organizing requires us to have a strong analysis on white supremacy, but also a strong analysis on capitalism and a strong class analysis. It is a moral imperative of any revolutionary, whether you call it radical or whatever, to understand and make an accurate assessment of the moment, to understand it ain't about the Republican Party. The Democratic Party ain't gonna fix shit. Yeah. Our assessment of the current moment is there is a tactical disagreement amongst the wealthy. The ruling class is not politically monolithic. There is a debate happening. And so what is our analysis of what that debate is? How are we making sure that we're exploiting the differences within the ruling class? And that we are deepening a strong class analysis amongst our people, amongst Black people.
Let's talk about that class analysis, and then I'm going to pivot to some audience questions. I'm still looking at the time, but this idea of class analysis is critical, particularly at a moment where so much of the mainstream political discourse is about the middle class. And from the middle class. It's both and. How do we center or recenter the Black poor in our political analysis, in our organizing, and in our theorizing, and how does Malcolm help us get there? Yeah.
Well, the question for me begins with how did we lose focus upon the Black poor and the Black worker in a city like Philadelphia? You know, this is the poorest city of the top largest cities in the country. And it's one thing to be up here, but perhaps to really understand what the legacy of Malcolm would mean in the 21st century, we perhaps should take tours around those parts of Philadelphia where the poor are invisible. And maybe that's why our analysis and our discourse don't include them. I find it profoundly offensive that so much of intellectual and academic discourse is about everything but the Black poor. It's almost as though our intelligentsia is following their white professors at the universities who have a completely different agenda, an agenda to save capitalism, to reform it, to give it a different aesthetic and maybe complexion, but not to save the Black proletariat. The Black poor and the Black proletariat is almost the same thing. I think we need some new language. I mean, let's not be afraid to talk about the Black working class, the Black proletariat, that woman who has to get up at 4:30 in the morning to be at a job at 6 o'clock where she's making below minimum wage. I call that a real feminist question. And there are many transgendered people in the Black community who work in those kind of jobs. I think, in other words, I'm saying that we have to re-anchor our thinking. But not only our thinking, but our praxis. How are we going to fight this system? And who are we fighting for? And who are we fighting with? Muhammad Ahmed is not here. He, like me, is OG. And, you know, a lot depends, like you say, your father. A lot is dependent upon what you have seen. In other words, if you've seen a movement against poverty and war and economic exploitation, your intellectual DNA is a little bit different if you haven't seen that kind of movement. I think, really, Mark, we talk about narratives and stories. I want to hear what your narrative and this. I think we have a lot of narratives about a previous period of resistance that a lot of times we don't want to hear, that are not popular, that are not, now I'm going to get personal. You'll lose your job at a university if you talk a certain way. And you won't get hired if you talk a certain way. So the narrative is managed, not by us, but by the white establishment, even when we call ourselves radical. That's a word, excuse me, I'm going to shut up there. That is a word that has become comfortable in the narrative of racial heritage.
So I just want to say two things quickly, because I know you want to open it up, Mark, but just, it's burning on me that when we talk about, when you ask the question, when did that happen? Why did we ever distance ourselves from the black working class, from the black proletariat? And I think that Malcolm understood, like no one else, how deeply internalized our white supremacy was. When you really listen to Malcolm X's speeches, and this is, there's no social media, he's speaking to black people. He's indicting white supremacy before audiences of black people. He definitely would go out publicly and point the finger at it and name the thing a thing, but his mission was to deconstruct, to revolutionize the black community from within, to expose that white supremacy, right? Because with a lot of us, it's almost like we don't want to be around poor black folks because they remind you of who you are. It's anti-black. It's your anti-blackness coming up, whether it's in the academy, whether it's in these major nonprofit industrial complexes. There's a lot of anti-blackness inside of us that Malcolm was trying to cure us of by exposing how we see ourselves and challenging it with how he sees us. That's why that book resonates so much with anyone, whether they're in the highest halls of academia or they're in a prison cell. Because it actually challenges you from what you're seeing from yourself and what he sees, what's really there. And so I think how we've gotten away from it is that as leaders, even as intellectuals, even as, radical or revolutionary organizers, we forget that we need to still just keep talking to our people. That's right. That's our audience. But the popularity, right? The retweets, the media, the stage, it has us trying to talk to too many different audiences, and we're gonna fail at one of them. Right. Marketers know that. They do targeted marketing. I don't see the same commercial that my neighbor 2 blocks up sees on Facebook, because they get that. But as activists, we don't. So we on CNN, we talking to our people, but we talking to CNN, and we talking to everybody else that watch CNN. And we're like, it's schizophrenic. So that made me think of that.
Isn't that a manifestation of our lack of commitment and courage? There's a reason why we're talking about Malcolm X, not only because of his ideas, but because of his courage. And where did that courage come from? It comes from a deep commitment to change and to revolutionary change. I am I'm serious. How did it happen that we're no longer committed to the least of our people, the poor? Why? When did it happen? And who is managing this process of separating those who can speak from those?
The channels to our people.
The who?
The platforms, the channels, how you speak to how we talk to our people. We don't own, we do not have power over even the means to which our people get information, to speak to them. So you're talking to your people from the same stations and the networks that are curating who's talking to them and what messages they are hearing.
So we're using the ruling class to mediate our conversation with our people.
Yeah.
Is that not a failure? And must we not
It's a failure. It's totally a failure. And you have to build the mechanism because the soapbox on the street corner, that's not where our people are getting their information. Where are we going to get that information?
Technology.
I want y'all to both engage this question. Who has questions in the audience? Okay, so this is what we're going to do. Because I'm tired and hungry. I've been up for 24 hours. Let me see them hands again. We'll go, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hands. Got 2. Oh, I apologize. All right, so there's 7 hands. So this is what we're going to do. I'm gonna bounce back and forth. Please answer those questions. Please keep engaging. I need to walk.
It's real short. I think it's definitely courage and discipline and commitment, but it's also analysis, because you can have a lot of courage and fight the wrong thing.
Exactly.
But it's so when I think about when did the capture happen? I think about sort of like the hyper professionalization that has happened over the decades of movement work. The philanthropic sector has grown. It's expanded, and so our enemy is funding us to limit our imaginations and to circumvent revolution.
Wow.
And we haven't come up with a scenario to disrupt it. I say this as someone who's a paid organizer. I'm clear about where my money comes from. I'm clear. So I think about hyper-professionalization, NGOization of our work. We need to build a movement that can sustain itself at some point. At least I think about, if not this generation, then the next generation. I always think about how are we giving the next generation a fighting chance? And how are we deepening their analysis so they understand the exact ways in which revolution is often circumvented throughout history and in this moment now.
I know we got to get to questions, but I just want to trouble perhaps an underlying assumption. So when did we lose sight of the question of organizing on behalf of the black working class, black poor people? And I'm wondering if the very way in which the question is being asked is too then and now, that it elides the class contradictions that were existing before Jim Crow collapsed, that were evident in racial uplift discourse, right? So that what we're talking about as a moment where there's a discourse around the black poor, right? Where there's a moment where however we might want to narrate black power and a particular ideological current within it, that there was some attention to the black poor. But for the most part, you have black middle class elites aspiring to be black upper middle class elites, defining African American politics for most of the 20th century. Now, however you want to think, so I'm saying there's class divisions always. Now, there's a way in which we have a discourse around black poverty, around poverty generally. Right now, it's in Reverend Bobbie with the Poor People's Campaign. But it's profoundly moral in its orientation. It's profoundly moral in its orientation. So the kinds of questions the question I'm asking, are we in some ways romanticizing a previous moment about black politics in order to characterize contemporary evidence of class divisions? And what we need perhaps is a better story of the depth of the class divisions within the black community from the first place. Does that make sense?
But the other, just quickly.
I didn't want to rejoin, but just quickly.
Just a rejoin.
Yeah.
I think you said a different narrative. I think we have enough evidence, it's abundant, that the discussion, at least as it is publicized by books, by media, it's as she said, it's overly determined by people with academic degrees, especially PhDs, that such a location of the discussion predisposes it to the, quote, aspiring petty bourgeoisie within our community and away from the working class. Yes, Reverend Barber, but you on the media regularly, how in 2020. I mean, I just think the poor are not there. And it's not to talk about a previous period or romanticize a previous period, but there was a qualitative difference between that moment. Jimmy Baldwin wrote prolifically and never had a university job or maybe an adjunct somewhere, you know. I mean, the same with all of our great leaders. I think the universities have corrupted the black intelligentsia, and let's be real.
Yes.
I don't want us to think that the work is not happening. Because you spoke about Barbara, but also there's black women throughout the South that are organizing poor people. You got Mary Brooks and Southerners on the ground. You got Shariqua Hill in Mississippi who's organizing black Mississippi women who work in factories. I mean, by the hundreds. So the work is happening. It may not be visible all the time, but there are definitely leaders among us that are dedicated to that work, day in and day out, and have been for decades. I just wanted to throw that in there.
We got questions. We ain't going to have a long time for question and answer, but we're going to get to as many as possible. We're going to start here, we're going to go here, then there. Okay?
Hi. Unpopular opinion, but I'm going to start with foregrounding some things. As a black, southern, queer, poor person at an Ivy League university, I feel like I occupy a really fucked up ambivalent position to some of the politics and discourses and narratives that you all have put on the table. But I have an issue with the ways that you've talked about ADOS. And so I want to foreground my question first and give you a bit of background on those things. So my question is, are you absolutely dismissing the issues in particular that the ADOSO movement articulates, as opposed to actually offering a critique of the ways that it has been constructed and co-opted on something like social media and the funding sources that you all have talked about? I arguably believe that the ADSO movement actually is a working class issue, right? And that's not a thing that we're actually taking up. And I think there's been a willful neoliberal misreading of the ADSO movement, because if you paid attention to how Mark put that on the table, he talked about Twitter. Now, perhaps he was being a little dramatic, facetious, what have you, but for the most part, ADOS has been granted access and legibility by being given a name. But this is not a movement, or I should say, I'm less interested in the movement and more interested in the questions that are actually being articulated and some of the issues that are being foregrounded by ADOS. These are not issues that happened to uprise overnight. You can actually trace some of these issues throughout the long 20th century in many black social movements, whether international or specifically domestic. And it is not actually exclusive to the issues of black people in America. But that's the willful neoliberalist misreading that is being articulated in this moment, or at least in the moment of this discussion. And so with that in mind, I'm wondering, are you actually going to take up the issues that ADOS articulates, or are you just going to continue to dismiss it because of how social media has suddenly taken hold of it over the last 2 years?
To the panel.
Thank you for that question, and I think that, so the American Descendants of Slaves conversation, I'm going to talk about the conversation, and I don't want to describe the movement because I'm not someone that's in that particular movement. You know, I consider myself a part of the broader reparations movement, but the discussion that's happening because of the ADOS moment that's happening in social media is actually very important. You know, it's sharpening, it's making us more rigorous with how we are thinking and talking about reparations. And the critique that we're raising that's happening from a certain part of that discussion is that it is coming across very anti-immigrant, very anti-black immigrant, right? And that it places too large of a burden, or at least this is what I was trying to articulate, it places too large of a burden on quote-unquote immigrants. It gives too much, it makes that so large of a role that's being played on our oppression that's giving it too much credit for it. And that in fact, what we need to do is we need to build solidarity between black communities and not let the reparations discussion become a wedge between those communities, because we can't win without each other. So I but it's definitely not to dismiss all of the thought leaders and all of the organizers and the people who are thinking about, hey, what about specifically those of us who were slaves under this U.S. government? I think what we're criticizing is how that discussion has emerged to a space where it's casting off members of our very African diasporic community.
But let's be clear, you guys.
Hold on, let me give you a mic. Let me give you a mic. Just so everybody can hear you.
And then I know this could be a spirited dialogue, but I want to give you a chance to respond. And then another re-engagement, then I have to move to the next questions for time's sake.
Sis, I think that was a beautiful articulation of your point. And if we missed that in the moment that you were speaking, my apologies, but I don't think that was the point that you made earlier. There was, with the exception of the brother in the camel jacket on the end, there was an agreement amongst the three of you that the ADSO movement is incredibly problematic because it is xenophobic. And for the most part, the rest of the room agreed. There was no nuance to that conversation. Sis, you started this conversation out earlier in the evening talking about the issue with neoliberal logic, and you then did a neoliberal misreading of ADOS. In fact, that was echoed by you, Brother Claude, and you, sis, and it's incredibly problematic. That is to say, I'm not interested in the pretty rhetoric. You had an opportunity when you were initially granted the question by Mark to actually articulate that nuance. And so it feels disingenuous to have that be articulated right now and not when it mattered, which is when the issue was first put on the table. I agree with the statement that you just made, but that's not what is happening. What is happening is that most people are seeking out applause and actually agreeing with the majority and not actually taking the opportunity to nuance the situation. That's not what's happening. That's not what happened on this stage.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to own something very specific that you said, which is that it was said on the panel that ADOS was xenophobic. I'm going to own that because I actually believe that I have xenophobia, that throughout our movement, our xenophobia is exploited to our demise, and that I'm offering xenophobia as a critique. Albeit, it maybe didn't come across as a loving critique, but there are ways that those who are working against us can tap into our xenophobia, our fears, whether it is our homophobia, whether it's our anti-immigrant nature. There are things that we are socialized to feel emotionally that people can tap into to exploit us as a movement. And so I think maybe it was Thenjiwe that said xenophobia, but I'm going to embrace it with you and stand together on that there is a level of xenophobia within that discussion of ADOS, and that it's being used to exploit differences that we should be embracing. I don't want it to be contentious. It has gotten contentious. And people like you and people like me need to figure out how to make it not so, but I am going to own that there is a level of xenophobia in what is being put forth, that somehow people who come from a particular line of slavery should be censured at the expense of others who come from other lines of slavery.
Go ahead. I just want Thenjiwe to get an opportunity to respond, and then I want to move to another question just because of the time.
Sure. How y'all doing? Hey. So this is the work. So I just want to love up on Monifa for your offering, because I don't have very much to add, but I do want to express gratitude for you. I oftentimes we hear things and it doesn't sit right with us. So I just want to express gratitude that you're here, fully saying what you feel. And I would love an opportunity to sit and talk with you and debate a little bit more. It's very difficult to get into nuance in very short remarks. So I would just want to make that offering, and hopefully we can have that opportunity. I'm very pro reparations. I'm pro a lot of different things, but I don't disagree, nor will I deviate from some of the points I made. And I'm happy to talk more about with you around sort of the anti-immigrant xenophobic sentiment that I see happening. I think that's important. I think it's important to name both of what I've seen coming out of the ADOS space, and then how it then has been operating within sort of a larger discourse. But anyway, I want to continue having that discussion with you, and I just also want to express gratitude and make that offering that hopefully we can talk about more.
All right, I'm going to take two questions, yours and yours, and then let's see. We'll see. Who else had their hand up? All right, yeah, some of y'all will be disappointed. a suitably brief response, and then we're gonna go there with these two, and then we all gonna go home. Or Uncle Bobbie's even better. Y'all can talk about this till 11 o'clock, I promise.
Thank you. I have a question that's really coming out of the panel before this in connection with this one. I am an immigrant, but one thing I do see is that immigrants, when they come to America, they climb all over African Americans, and often you see anti-blackness within the immigrant community. So I do agree with sister over there that, you know, it's not the same, it's not equivalent. I'm an Indian person, I came here, I have certain advantages that, you know, I can get jobs that African Americans cannot get, and I can see that. I see, you know, as Baldwin called it, remember this house. And there's the front of the house, there's the back of the house, there's outside the house, there's inside the house. And the races, the darker races, are used in different ways by the white man. And one of the things that I love about Malcolm X, spoke to the end, and I hope you can comment on this, going back to Islam and internationalism. One of the things he said in the letter from Mecca was, you know, the evil of America will be exposed by Islam ultimately, because he saw that this whole whiteness thing was made up here. And, you know, when you see the peoples of the world, we are, you know, we're united in God. So I just was wondering if you could comment more on that.
I mean, that was I think a self-contained analysis, and we appreciate that. Thank you for offering that to the conversation. I think it's really going to enrich everything. That's on you.
Thank you. I just wanted to shift back to the question of why Malcolm X is important today. And I think one of the reasons why Malcolm was so significant is because he realized what Martin Luther King Jr. called the single garment of destiny. And that manifested through his opposition to, as Dr. Monterio said, the CIA intervention in the Congo and the Vietnam War, wars which devastated people abroad and people in the black community. So my question is, considering Malcolm's opposition to U.S. imperialism during his time, what position would Malcolm take today on U.S. intervention in Venezuela, aggression against Iran, and the consolidation of NATO getting closer to Russia's border, provoking a nuclear war? Why would his position be important to the question of the future of humanity?
You know, that's a great question, and honestly, with time, we won't be able to get another one after that, but thank you for that wonderful question. If y'all could answer that, I think that's a great one. Because it's 10 minutes to 9. Yeah,
It's like, that's it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to be, how many more hands were up?
Just 3.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll take one more. The elder has requested that. His brother, I did tell him I'd take his hand, so we'll take this one at the same time, and then we'll answer that and go home.
How you doing? I just wonder if it's worth even considering, like, when you think about Malcolm, you gotta try to think about his lineage. You know, that lineage, Ali, Mustafa, Muhammad, Elijah Muhammad, and what supreme wisdom was, and those questions that are in the supreme wisdom, and the value of who is the original man, and why know the circumference of the earth, and how much land and water there is. And, you know, I think that too often when people talk about Malcolm, they divorce him from his lineage. They talk about his politics. They talk about his historical record, but because of my lineage, I understand his lineage. I'm from Nation of Gods and Earth's lineage, so that's a direct descendant of the Nation of Islam. And within that, I understand there's a worldview that comes out of that. That's kind of what I'm getting at. And I'm wondering if it's worth considering, as people are having this conversation about how to apply Malcolm's philosophy, if it's worth considering the final points of what made Malcolm who he is, because there is a worldview that comes out of it.
Question. So I want to get to this imperialism thing. I want to take your question very serious. Were you here for the last panel? Brother, did you catch the last panel? Okay, because most of that was answered in the last panel on Malcolm and Islam. That's the only reason No, it's all good, but and we got the video of it, so when you go to YouTube, you'll see the way that Brother Wesley Muhammad talked about it. I mean, actually the whole panel talked about those relationships. Because one of the things I asked about was Malcolm's changing theology, or whether or not it changed. The panel pushed back against that. And that's fair. And so, but the question was, what does the 120 have to do with it? What does Supreme Wisdom have to do with that? What does an ontological claim, or what is a claim about white people? Who is the colored man? Right? Who is the original man? Right? How do these questions help Malcolm understand who and what he was? So we got through that in the last panel, and I'm gonna make sure you check it out, and everybody can check it out on YouTube in about 3 days. No, it ain't no bad. How bad is we here for?
It's no bad, and I want to throw in, we need to look at Malcolm's matrilineage too, the impact of his mother as a revolutionary journalist and an editor at RBI, the impact that his sisters and his aunts had on him and all of his siblings, which led them in many ways to the organizations that they joined and started later. So to double down on that, let's also look at his matrilineage.
Absolutely. Keisha Blaine's book talks about that a little bit with regard to Malcolm's mother. So Keisha Blaine has a wonderful book that came out last year. She was here last year for the Malcolm X Symposium. It's across the street as well, if you want to check it out at Uncle Bobbie's. And of course, Bell looks at a collection of essays, one of which is really critiquing the Malcolm X the movie, and one of the things she talks about is Spike's failure to account for the women in Malcolm's life. So in both those ways, we can really dig deep on this question that you just asked. That's a wonderful question, brother. Thank you so much. I want to toss to the panel this last, was it another hand?
The imperialism?
Yeah, I want to toss to imperialism. Was it who? Yeah, I did. Last question. You see, I'm trying to matumbo the questions for the panel.
So real quick, I'm a working poor person, and I'm beautiful. I'm a mother of 5, got from 25 to soon to be 4. Long story short, I'm thinking about a future, like for black people, Mexican, whatever, but I'm talking about black people. My experience, right? So what does that look like, seriously? Like, how do I really get free? Because at the end of the day, it ain't enough academic jobs, it ain't enough Pathmark jobs, it ain't enough ShopRite jobs for all of us. So how do we get self-sufficient like when our ancestors were slaves and still had humanity, creativity, imagination? How do we get back and still was alive? Ate good food, whatever. So how, because I'm sick of this games that we playing. And I live in North Philly, work in North Philly, and I'm sick of people coming to work, coming to the library where I work to get a ShopRite application, right? You're going to get $7.25. Like, how does that even work? And what does that, for my 6-year-old son, what does it look like? So, I really need some real answers. Like, we talking about this and that, but how do we get free, for real?
That's the question of the day. Domestic context, but also in the global context with regard to imperialism, etc.
In all modesty and humility, sister, we would need another conference, and we should have another conference on the strategy and tactics of black liberation in this 21st century, because we do have to rethink. And hopefully, it won't be a majority of us, let us say thinkers, but it will be a revolutionary minority that will come forth, that can fight for unity and for the things that we're talking about. And there is no strategy or tactics for black liberation that is not at the same time a strategy of attack upon the imperialism of the United States' own government. And for that reason, I find it to be a self-defeating strategy to think that a Joe Biden or any of the other 23 of them or Donald Trump can be can constitute a force that would create time for us to fight for liberation. I think it's time that we develop, and answer the questions that you've put on the table that all go back to the black working class, that invisible part of the black community.
One second. Okay, I'll be brief. I appreciate that. I think oftentimes we talk to things and around things without actually talking about like what is freedom. Yeah. And for me, it's like who has the power? Like where is the locus of power? And so for me, freedom is a radical realignment of power, where power is not just power doesn't just sit with a few very wealthy people, but we're talking about a radical realignment of power where people have power and they're able to like make decisions about their own lives and not be governed by the interests of those who are just serving to like grow their own wealth. And then how do we do that? Well, I mean, a couple of different things. Obviously, we talk about an end to white supremacy, and we need to stop talking about just an end to capitalism, but an alternative to capitalism. Like, and be honest about what are we talking about? Like a different kind of economy, a different way of people being able to like resource themselves and to work and to survive. But the big question is, what the hell do we do in the meantime? Like, none of this is going to happen. I mean, we need clarity on what the hell we're working towards, and we're not even clear around that a lot of times. Around the actual alternative vision, we're more clear about what we want to tear down. But the other piece is like, how do we protect, defend, and love each other in the meantime? And what are we building in order to like hold each other down? And also to like both mitigate harm, decrease the harms that happen to our people, but also like increase the likelihood that our people can not just survive, but live okay lives. Like, what is our strategy on the road to actually like shifting things completely?
Fight for a living wage in the midst of this moment, right? And have immediate tangible impacts. We're in a moment in which the age of rating is collapsing. This is what you see. We have elites. The elites are having an argument. White folk, white men, high school educated white men are dying at higher rates of suicidality, opioid addictions. What's going on? Neoliberalism, the winds of neoliberalism are such that whiteness can't even protect you from it in interesting sorts of ways, as white workers are just feeling the brunt. So the contradictions are in full view. So something is collapsing. And the question is, what's going to be born? And so in this moment, what they're trying to do is to shrink our imaginations of what's possible. That's why Joe Biden is trying to stuff it down our throats. Right? They're trying to shrink what we think is possible. So we have an opening in the midst of this crisis. And it's in that moment that we have to begin to offer up a robust vision for how we can be otherwise. And this is going to require, right, fundamentally challenging the assumption that a country can be predicated upon the fact that people are disposable. Right? And I think if we begin to make that argument, while we're fighting for a living wage, while we're fighting for Medicare for all, while we're trying to in some ways buy ourselves some time, as Jimmy would say, right? Buy ourselves some time, then we can in fact make the country, perhaps make the country what we hope it might be.
Thank you. I'll end my comments on the piece about immigration, because I think the sister there was talking about the differences that, of course, immigrants who come to the United States, how they experience the United States versus African people or descendants of slaves in the United States. And part of what you were mentioning, and I think it ties the whole conversation together, is that the white supremacy that this all sits on is very constructed, right? I think in a previous panel, Hitler was mentioned, and the white supremacy that was used there in Europe was actually imported from the U.S. People think of the other way, that that white supremacy came to the United States from this particular regime or some of the tactics, but a lot of what that evil regime used were white supremacist tactics from the United States. But the piece about it being constructed is so important. I think that's why we're getting into this challenge around immigrants, and especially around our relationship to other black immigrants, is because not only is white supremacy constructed, the nations are constructed, right? All of the boundaries, the colonies. There's nothing but a whim to say that Haiti wouldn't have been a part of the United States like Puerto Rico is, right? So it's all kind of like, we're having these arguments within these lines and within these constructs that are to aid and abet a specific structure, to aid and abet white supremacy. So it says this part of this is in this country, this is not in this country, that's a part of our, who we are, and that's not. And so I just want us to continue this conversation. Like, I want to double down on what Thenjiwe said. I also want to open myself up to have more conversations about the ADOS issue. And just to put it out there, I think part of my struggle is just wanting to look at it beyond the boundaries that have been constructed that really mean very little to how we experience You know, let me say, Brooklyn, for example, my brothers and sisters who came there from Haiti versus my family that came here from Texas, right? And so I want to look at those nuances, and I don't want to be lumped into these boundaries and these constructs, as was stated.
Absolutely. And my brother, the other piece of it, I think, is just real quick, just so you, because I don't think your question got directly answered, which is, I think Malcolm Malcolm opposed imperialism. And I think Malcolm would oppose some of the imperial counter-revolutions we've seen over the last 10 years, instigated by the United States. I think whether we talk about Libya, I mean, we're going down the list. I think he would look at a place like Syria and have certainly a critique of Assad, right? But he would also say that American imperial intervention, which that.
I don't think he would.
Okay, and that's a private conversation we can have offline. I would love to have that conversation. I think at least with regard to chemical warfare, okay, just. Strict cool.
The United States is the biggest purveyor of violence in the world, outside and inside the country.
Yeah, but I'm not sure. I'm not disputing that claim. I'm saying that at the same time, we could also have a critique of another regime. Malcolm could have a critique of another regime. But if you think Malcolm wouldn't have a critique of another regime, I'll hold that point. We can think through it together. I'd like to think, though, that at some moment, and there's certainly evidence in Malcolm's writings and his diaries, etc., that he had critique certainly of anti-black racism in the Middle East. He had critique of imperial counter-revolutions. And I think he would look at Venezuela. I think he would look at Iran as examples of American imperialism, and he would strongly oppose any U.S. policy. I think he would generally oppose U.S. foreign policy on the grounds that it is part of a colonial and neo-colonial project. That would be my answer to your question. Again, we can think through it together. I'd love to. Just, after 9 o'clock. But family, this panel has been incredible. And I want to thank Monifa and Bandele and Thenjiwe. Tony, I'm sorry, my throat it wasn't no signifying I had something in my throat. But more importantly, I want to thank all of you for being here today, staying with us from 3 o'clock. I want to thank all the panelists who have been here for all the panels. I want to thank Uncle Bobbie's staff. I want to thank Isabella Ballester, who organized all of this. That's her in the back, right there, waving. I want to thank her. I want to thank Genevieve for holding it down as well. She's running out the room because she don't like attention. And I want to thank all of you for supporting Uncle Bobbie, supporting the Malcolm X Symposium. This was the second annual one. The third one's going to be just as good, just as big. In a month, we got the Palestine teaching. But beyond that, I want you all every day to continue to support not just us, but all the black businesses, all the black bookstores, all the black cafes in the city. I want you to show love to each other. Let's keep operating in the tradition of Malcolm. Thank you all. I'll see you later. Peace.
And let's give some love to Mark Lamont Hill.